I will quickly introduce today's speaker. Our dear Dr. Nina Beaman will be sharing her perspective on how she has been able to apply the concepts of diplomacy as an element of effective and persuasive communication. She's the Chief Nursing Administrator of the School of Nursing of Health and Sciences at Aspen University, the daughter of a U.S. diplomat, Chester Beaman, and has lived in Beirut, Lebanon, Cairo, Port Said, Egypt, Manila, the Philippines, Damascus, Syria, Athens, Greece, Rome, Italy, Malta, and Nice, France. Woo! Learning all about that, the diplomacy from her parents, she used diplomacy to advocate for the improvements in patient care and community safety. She's going to discuss today some of the case studies of how to use these techniques to further our causes. So please, Nina, if there's anything I missed, introduce yourself, and we'll all turn off our cameras while you're presenting to save some bandwidth.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for coming. I do appreciate this. And I'm glad to see so many people are interested in this topic. This has been my life. And I'll explain why as we go through the slides, which I hope I can advance. There we go. We're recording, so that's all good. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. Like she said, diplomacy was from birth in my particular case. My parents were U.S. diplomats, my father having already met my mother at the Pentagon. It's a really romantic story where she was hiring people to go back to Germany after the war. And she asked him, he asked everybody, why should I hire you? And he said, I want to travel. And he said, everybody wants to travel. She said, why should I hire you? So eventually she hired him to be my father. So sort of a cute love story. And he actually, just a little tidbit of history, he was the sketch artist at the Nuremberg trials. Back in those days, they didn't have C-SPAN and all that. So he was the one who sketched the Nazis as they were being tried for war crimes. And his sketches are currently appear at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So if you think you've seen Chester Beaman as a name before, that was one of the many things that he did. But he went on to become a U.S. diplomat until he was about 80 years old. He served with the State Department. And so that really was my whole life, was the daughter of a diplomat, you know. So when Michael and I were talking about what I should present today, he said, you know, you really ought to present some of the things that have happened in your life and how you've used those techniques. So anyway, having introduced myself a bit, I'm going to talk about how we can use diplomacy to get our way, okay? Because that's the whole idea of diplomacy, and create win-wins. And I'm going to case studies that have happened throughout my life and then conclude. But I always like to start with a land acknowledgement. Usually when I'm talking to you, I'm broadcasting through the wonderful internet from the traditional territories of the Monacan Nation. This is their symbol. I don't know if you can see it. I think it's really cool. But today I actually happen to be in my house in Richmond, and this is the Powhatan tribe of natives and indigenous people. But I really love this. I got it from The Sage because it talks about that everybody in here might have a different view. We have all had a different life, but we can sit in a circle. And this is why the theme, the design of all my slides is circular. I want us to imagine that we're sitting in a circle as brothers and sisters, and we're having a discussion here. And that even if we are different, even if we have different paradigms, even if we have disagreements, that we can sit in a circle with our different views and our differences, and we can respect and honor each other and those ideas. I hope. I did a little bit about myself. And so we're going to talk about using diplomacy to get our way. So this is an old photo because both of my parents are now deceased. But this was them outside of a pub, which is very typical for my dad. And the whole idea of diplomacy, if you're not a diplomat's child, is that a diplomat is able to see both sides, to talk to both sides, and I think Dominique sort of alluded to it, to be able to interact with both sides and maybe up with something that would please or honor, as the indigenous people say, honor and respect both sides. My father was brought up a Quaker. He continued to be a Quaker for the rest of his life. He was a peace-loving individual. He chose, as you heard in my introduction, to be a Middle East specialist. I think we were thrown out of an awful lot of countries because of that, because it's very hard to be a U.S. diplomat in the Middle East. Turn on the TV set and you'll see what kind of work it is to work in the Middle East. But he always tried to go both sides, talk to both sides, understand both sides, sip coffee, sometimes drink vodka with both sides, and understand both sides of an issue, so that then when it came to developing policy for the US government, both sides came to the table through my father. And also he communicated in a way that I always say that I'm sort of in a middle road kind of person, because I can always see both sides. But my father always brought us up, if we had a radical idea, he would share the other side, whether he agreed with it or not, but felt that we ought to be able to see both sides. This is a picture of him. His name was Chester Earl Beaman. And as I said, he was a U.S. diplomat. He served in most of those places until you got to Nice, France. That was me at the Université de Nice on my own. But other than that, I was living with my father for most of those. I was, I think one thing I did mention, I was evacuated from bombs dropping in Syria to Lebanon, to Greece, to Rome, where I finally found my father, and we came back to the United States. And so I think that adventure, can I call it that, of being an evacuee, probably precipitated me going on to get my doctorate in disaster management, and to decide that my nursing career trajectory would be to work in forensic mental health with victims of trauma and violence, in the hopes of helping them to become survivors, as I had. So I currently serve as a forensic nurse and a parish nurse, working with victims of trauma and survivors, as well as some refugees, by the way. But it's all because of the man who made me, and who made me who I am. And he was the diplomat of record, but I have to give credit to his wife. If you're a diplomat overseas, your wife, or your spouse, I should now say, is part of the deal. No, she didn't, quote, work outside the home, but she worked outside the home, because if he was meeting with the person serving, and it was almost always back then a man, she was meeting with the spouse or some significant person in the household to try to get the inside scoop on what was going on and bring it back to my dad. And then it was brought back to the United States. So they were a team. Diplomat and wife work as a team. So the idea of diplomacy is to create a win-win. And I found this picture and I was really glad, because my father was a model railroad enthusiast. I think he wrote his master's thesis on railroads. And he every year at Christmas time, no matter where we were, he had these model railroad trains, these tracks, and he would build a city, a town, I guess I would say, with mountains that we would, paint and all this, and with bridges and roads, and there were little people and all this. In the first 8 years of their marriage, there were no children. So this was his domain. He ruled his world, sort of like most dictators, presidents, whatever. They would love to just rule their world, just move their little people around and just make things happen the way they want. And then came the toddlers, my brother first, and then me. And we would rearrange his world, because that's what toddlers do, right? And so we would sneak in when he wasn't there, and we would readjust. And then the other toddler would come in and readjust, and we would put peanuts in the coal cars. And then as he was running his train around, we would try to pull the peanuts out of the little train, and then I would stop the train. Now, some fathers might have a meltdown, because what? The toddlers are touching the train, right? My domain is invaded. But not my dad, because he waited so long to have children. He was 40 when he had me, and I think 39 when he had my brother. He loved those children, and he could see the world from our vantage point on tiptoes. I had a little step stool to get on tiptoes just to get up there to reach and destroy his little environment, But he could see, well, the kids sort of want to mess with my world. And that's diplomacy, because he's going over to another country. And we like to say, we're Americans. We know how to do it. We understand democracy. We need to impose our democracy on your model. That is not really the way that the other countries saw it, typically. They didn't just want to become America. They wanted to pick and choose parts of America that they liked, and they wanted to not have parts of America that they didn't like. And so this is sort of an example of how, yeah, you want the world to go exactly the way you want. And often our politicians want it that way. Well, I am in power. I'm in control. I want it my way. But we have to be able to see how the other wants it. And we don't want the other invading our way of life often. So, and if you take nothing else home, take a shot of this. The other is not the enemy. We were toddlers. And, we didn't have the understanding that our father did about things break and stuff like that. And so often when diplomats are talking to people in other countries, they don't necessarily understand that if you do this, this will happen. If you do this, this is how the American government is going to interpret it. The other is not an enemy. The other just maybe has a knowledge deficit. Isn't that a lovely nursing term, right? They need to have more knowledge that I can sort of fill, usually over a party or a coffee or whatever diplomatic assignment that he particularly had. He had to go into every encounter knowing what he wanted or what his country wanted to get out of it. But he also had to have a feel for what they wanted. So when you go into any encounter with anybody in power, know what you want, but also know what they want. So again, you know the negotiation terms, and then be willing to compromise somewhat. Like I said, we couldn't totally tear up the trains, but there were certain things that we could mess with in his little environment and still get away with it. So you through some things that happened in my life, and Michael went on this journey with me, and I told him about some of the things that happened. He said, you just need to share this because this is so good. But when I was in high school at Hayfield High School in the 70s, okay, it was a long time ago, all right, there was a guy who taught government. He looked just like this. Jim Dillard was his name. And he was running for office, and I was an office assistant, and I thought, nice guy, I should go help him. And I didn't really care what party he worked for. I didn't even have a political philosophy, but I went, I want to call it door knocking. Nobody ever answered the door, but we had these little things that if they didn't answer the door, you just hooked on their doorknob, So I went out and I put all these Dillard for Delegates things on the doorknobs. Well, the story, I didn't tell you this, Michael, but he lost. but eventually in 1980, he did become Delegate Dillard, And later, when I was having some domestic violence issues in my own home, I looking into some of the laws in Virginia, which were very much that you are your father's property if you're a woman, and then when you get married, you become your husband's property. It was all based on Old English law, and Virginia was an English, colony, and they were very archaic, and they needed to be changed. And I wrote Delegate Dillard and said, I don't know if you remember me, but I was a student at Hayfield High School, and I knocked on doors for you. And sure enough, they got the laws changed. And so I was like, wow, just a little, afternoon of my own time and maybe knowing somebody helped. So that was my first little success. And again, it was highly personal. And then I shared my personal story. I said, this is what's going on with me and other women, please help. And he was a really great guy. I looked him up recently, and he doesn't look like he's done anything, so I'm not sure he's still with us, but he turned out to be a fabulous delegate. But you never know whether just a little bit of support can get you something down the road. Now, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia and I are pen pals. I write him when I like something. I write him when I don't like something. I thank him when he does things I like, but you can bet that he gets a lot of emails from me. And this photo was taken. He was running to go vote. And I said, Senator Kaine. And he turned on his heels, flipped around and said, well, let's do a photo, Nina. And so all these women that were with me went, oh. It was literally a second. We all came together and they shot this photo of us. This is outside of his office, and he ran on to vote. But I want to tell you a story about me and his rep. His assistant comes out to my little town, and it's not all that big. There's only 12,000 people in my county, and she has these town halls. And people line up and they're mad. They aren't getting their Social Security, and the government has screwed them over in some way or the other. So anyway, I waited all day. I just listened to all this. I just patiently listened to it. And in the end, I was the last person there at the end of this long line of people that are angry with the government, mostly, not Senator Kaine as much as the government. And so I went up and she said, so how can I help you? And I said, you look like you need a hug. And I gave her a hug and I turned around to leave. She said, really? You waited here all day to give me a hug? And I said, yeah, I've listened to those stories. And it sounds like after all that, you really need a hug. She said, well, is there something that's important to you? So we had a little chat about mental health needs in Virginia. Now, don't you think when she went back to the office and he said, okay, so what were the issues today, that she remembered me? Because again, I learned as a diplomat, what were her needs? She needed a hug. Let's deal with her needs, and then let's deal with this. And I have met with her several times, and she sort of remembers me as the hugger, and it's okay because she knows I hug, and that's okay. But he is very responsive to me, because not only do I write to complain, but I write to thank him for everything he does, and he's very supportive. The other senator, Senator Mark Warner, is a phone call guy. And so I've been on several phone calls with him. Now, I live in rural Virginia. If you've ever seen the Waltons, it's about a family in the post-Depression area in Nelson County. And the guy who wrote it, Earl Hamner, actually lived down the street a piece, from me a few miles. And so it's very, very rural, and it tends to vote very, very much the other party. So one night, out of the blue, I got a phone call and said, hold for Senator Warner. And I'm like, yeah, right. Except I do know what he sounds like. And so Senator Warner gets on the phone. Now, his mission was, I wonder how I can get more votes in that area, right? I mean, that was his mission, but he didn't say that. He said, I know I've gotten a lot of letters from you, and I'd really like to know, in your area, what do you need? And I said, broadband, one word, broadband. This was pre-COVID. We really need broadband. I teach online, and Virginians, can't go to school. They can't, do what they need to do without broadband. 2 weeks later, I had broadband. And the people in my area went, how come you got broadband? I said, well, I asked Senator Warner for broadband. Now, notice that he didn't call households who were hostile to him, because they would have hung up on him. But he was seeking to know from someone who wasn't hostile to him, how can I serve the people in that community? And that was me, because I'm not hostile to him. And he does a lot of phone calls. He writes me sort of, you can tell an assistant wrote the letter, but he phone calls out of the blue. And this was an interesting story. I'm a forensic nurse. And so one of the things that I do is that when people invite me to come speak, I go speak. And you can hear, because I'm here today, because someone invited me to speak. So here I am, right? So I was invited to speak on how to survive an active shooter by Noon Rotary in Radford. Okay, noon. All right. So it's breakfast time. And if I don't have breakfast, I'm going to be hungry by noon, right? And I'm going to be speaking, and you burn a few extra calories, when you're speaking. And so I'm thinking, I need to get breakfast. So I went to this little place that had one of those like long tables, and then they had like everybody at this long table, and there's a empty seat, 3 empty seats, and I'm with my daughter. And they said, don't sit there, he's in the bathroom. Okay, he's in the bathroom. Well, whoever he is, I won't sit in his seat. I will sit next to he's in the bathroom. And my daughter, who was very pregnant and very hungry, sat on the other side. So who sits down in the he's in the bathroom seat but U.S. Congressman Morgan Griffith of Southwest Virginia, because he's come there hoping to get votes. He does not know I'm not a constituent, and I don't share that information with him, okay? But I am sort of living there because my daughter's very pregnant. I'm waiting for the baby, whatever. So he sits down next to me, and I know him well enough to know that he is the chair of the Commerce Committee and that he's an active gun rights person. So do I discuss gun rights? Do I discuss the fact that he's having French fries for breakfast, which is not a wholesome meal? Or do I use that opportunity with the chair of the Commerce Committee to talk about human trafficking? So I say to him, commerce, huh? Do you know what kind of commerce is going up and down 81 through your counties? And he goes, what do you mean? 45 minutes this man talked to me, and I had all the talking points and all the data about the amount of human trafficking that was happening, not only in that part of Southwest Virginia, but also in the United States of America. Within 2 weeks, he'd put a bill before Congress to fight human trafficking. And he had offered to come speak to Aspen University. So that was a win-win. But you have to have these conversations ready. And as I was walking out the door, my daughter said, why didn't you fight him? This is her words, fight him on, guns. Because I wasn't going to win on guns. He and I were probably not going to come up on a middle ground on guns. But what we had in common was our love of proper commerce in the United States, and that human trafficking is not proper commerce. And he's been a champion against human trafficking ever since that breakfast meeting. Virginia Senator Creigh Deeds, and I don't know if you know the story of Creigh Deeds, but Creigh Deeds and I did not see eye to eye for years, but he was my Virginia senator. So many times I went to Creigh and said, we need more money for mental health. We need this and that and the other for mental health, and stayed in the room to watch him turn around immediately and vote against whatever it was I wanted. That was my life with Creigh Deeds until his son developed mental illness, specifically schizoaffective disorder, so bad that he heard voices that told him to kill his father. And so he attempted to kill his father and then killed himself. If you're not familiar with this, it's just a horrible story. But after that, Creigh then had a personal experience with mental health. I don't go anywhere where there's Creigh Deeds that he doesn't run to me and say, Nina, it's so good to see you, including the polls. He embraced me at the polls. I probably should have that picture, but he took it on his phone, so I don't have a copy of it. But he has actually turned around so much. But when that life event happened, there I was, not to scold him about his previous votes, but to feed him more and more information. And he has been a champion of mental health, both money and solutions in Virginia ever since that life event. But I had already planted the seed that nurses are your friends, and we're here for you when and if you change your mind on things. Now this, I'm circling back to the photo of my mother and father on their wedding day, because U.S. Congressman Denver Riggleman, and I'll ask you all later if you even recognize this name. He was my congressman for 4 years. Was voted out by the Republican Party for being basically too moderate. But he ran for office because he was running a distillery in Virginia and was outraged at the amount of taxes that were on distilleries in Virginia. That was his issue. So he opens up a distillery. It's not walking distance, but it's a couple miles from my home. And my husband, who's a chef and a connoisseur of whiskey, I'm trying to be polite there, spent an awful long time with Denver Riggleman prior to him becoming a congressman. So when he became a congressman, did I go in there and say, I'm a nurse, blah, 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 blah? No, no, no. I was George's wife. So sometimes, like I say, it's a team, and we still get Christmas cards from the Rigglemans and all that. But you may remember that Denver Riggleman was very involved in the January 6th hearings, and he may come back, but when he does, I'm sending George, my husband, in, because just like my father knew when to send his wife in, I know when to send my spouse in, because these two guys are drinking buddies, and he's a genuinely nice guy. But I knew that he had a wife and 2 daughters. And so when I went to talk to his assistant about women's issues, I knew he had a wife and 2 daughters. And so that was our inroads. And he was from my county, obviously, but that also he just had to drop the name of my husband, and Denver would go, oh, George, I know George, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the Arizona nursing is, I'm going to try to tread carefully on this, but the Arizona Board of Nursing has this standard that if your students don't pass the NCLEX exams at an 80% rate, they'll close you down. We had an 80% pass rate our first year, and then the next 2 years we did not. Not going to brag about our pass rates. The next 2 years, COVID came. They weren't great. We did have high pass rates on the second or third attempt, but our students rushed out right after graduation. They didn't take the Kaplan review. COVID was rampant. They waited a long time to take it. There were just so many factors. So there was a 2-year period where we just really didn't have good results. The Arizona Board of Nursing insisted that we close our schools. So we got a consent decree with the Arizona Board of Nursing, and a consent decree is an actual contract that says, okay, obviously we don't want to play this game anymore. We will close down our school, but we don't want the nursing students that are in the pipeline to be poorly affected. So we will not admit any new students, but you let us teach out. And we offer as proof that I personally had looked up every one of our graduates and gone through NurseSys, and none of our graduates had ever been brought before the board for any impairment or any safety issue in any board of nursing. And none of our facilities had ever had any complaint about any of our students ever having done anything. So on the 23rd of February, the Arizona Board of Nursing met. I was there. And they said, we want to close Aspen University because these students, wait for it, might someday commit an error. Now, if you know anything about just culture, pretty good chance that they would, but that's like saying, Nina, you can't have a driver's license because you might someday have an accident. It just really didn't make any sense. So the dean flew home, but the next day I went in and I said to the students, let's have a civics class. And I taught them, because I'm not a voter, there's nothing I can do, but I taught them civics. And so the students went to the legislators, their elected legislators, and their elected governor, and said, here's all the proof that no student, no graduate has ever done anything wrong. And further, the taxpayers have paid all this money to all these other schools to produce nurses that haven't produced the number of nurses that Aspen has. And yet the taxpayers have paid for it. This is costing you nothing to let us graduate and, take boards, etc. Further, we went to the judiciary, and a judge who was a contract judge looked at it and said, okay, here's a contract that says Aspen will admit no more new students, and you will keep Aspen open. Aspen has not admitted any more students, and you're closing it. That's breach of contract, and you will be liable for the tuition of all of these hundreds of students. So the Arizona Board of Nursing backed down, and that was simply because of teaching some civics. I didn't personally have to do it. I wasn't a voter in Arizona, but you can do it. And by the way, after all of this, I went to Sedona. Isn't this beautiful? This is actually a little chapel that's carved into the rocks in Sedona in Arizona. I highly recommend you go there sometime. And then I wanted to end with this. This is a story that is actually true, that during the Irish potato famine, the Choctaw Nation, which was a very poor indigenous nation, sent $170, which was an enormous amount of money, to Ireland for relief for the potato famine. And then during COVID-19, when America was struck and the Navajo Nation was particularly affected, Ireland sent $1.8 million back to the Navajo Nation. And this actually is a beautiful work of art in Dublin that the Irish built to thank the Navajo Nation for their, to thank the Choctaw Nation for their donation of $170 during the potato famine. And it just shows that a little bit of love and a little bit of diplomacy can go a long way. So I want to circle back to the 5 things I want you to remember about diplomacy. And that is that people like you or don't agree with you are not the enemy. Many times they just don't see things the way you do because they have a knowledge deficit. And, you know, we're nurses, right? We know all about knowledge deficits. Going into discussions, I love, Dominique, the way you said, even with patients, know what you want, but know what they want and be willing to compromise somewhat. Know where you would make compromises and where you wouldn't. And this, by the way, is corn that's called gem corn. I call it diversity corn. The Native Americans developed it, and it has seeds from so many different tribes all mixed in together. And that's why I call it diversity corn. So at this point, let me just put up my information. Should you need it, it is my name with a dot in the middle at aspen.edu. And I'm happy to entertain any questions anybody has about anything, or we can just discuss whatever you prefer.
That was so great. I don't know if you meant that presentation to be a comedy, but I was laughing the whole way and I absolutely loved it.
But I have very funny speeches. So yeah, it's my nature. And that's part of diplomacy too, is that if you come in so serious, then you lose people. But my father could tell stories. You know, he was an Irishman, and he could. I think I got that too.
That's so great. And it was I love that you made that homage to your heritage. It made me think about how, like, my story to nursing does not involve like a family of nurses or family of medical professionals. And so it was just like my calling. It was after the fact, after I already became a nurse, that I realized that, like, not only did I have 1 or 2 family members that were caretakers or caregivers that were not professionally medical professionals, but just that the foundations of nursing, the approach to medicine that nursing takes over other professionals is like, it's in our blood, right? Or it's like part of our DNA. It's like, it's just how we operate and exist as humans. But I also
would add, it's that synthesis. Remember those corns? That you bring all of yourself together to the nurse that you are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that you brought in the fact that, you know, your diplomatic partner or spouse or whoever it is, it brought from the home to the professional life how important partnerships are to move any kind of issue forward. And that you used your like rich lived experience to inform all of that. And something that's also close to my heart is having influence without authority. You know, sometimes people won't give you the title that's supposed to move things forward, but we have such powerful, rich lived experience that, you know, allows us to understand how all these things are intertwined, interconnected, and how we can work together. That power of networking requires shared values and recognizing needs. And like at the bedside, that's what we know as nurses, right? Like, you walk into a patient's room, you've got 30 seconds to build trust, to share that knowledge of what needs to be done, but also meeting that person where they are and knowing what they can take in, what they can learn, and how the knowledge that we have can be imparted in their like personal lives to take care of their own health. And what we do like, we also offer knowledge, but we offer compassion. And that was a theme throughout every one of your stories and interactions. But you also had to follow it up with your why, right? Like you have to keep your finger on the pulse, know the issue, have some of the data points, maybe not be like the most expert, but have enough expertise to build your why and share your why, sharing that knowledge, organizing others to be able to move things forward and get what you want and get what they want. So thank you so much. That was so great.